Alessandro Vale had broken every woman who ever stepped into his bedroom. They didn't leave with scars. They left with the terrifying realization that they were too fragile for a man who required total surrender just to feel alive. He was the king of a hollow empire, until a 20-year-old waitress looked at the monster in his eyes and didn't blink. She just asked if he wanted his usual. The silence in the VIP lounge wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum created by Alessandro's presence. He watched the newest server, Alira, move with a terrifyingly deliberate grace. Most people vibrated with the need to please him, but she moved as if he were a statue she was tasked with cleaning. When she finally approached, she didn't stand at a respectful distance. She leaned in, her crisp white collar brushing against the air he breathed, placing one hand on the back of his chair, not as a servant, but as an anchor. Alessandro felt the shift immediately. For the first time in a decade, he wasn't the one setting the performance stakes. He was being weighed, measured, and judged by a girl in a uniform who seemed to know exactly how much pressure it took to make a titan crumble. The silence in the VIP lounge wasn't empty. It was heavy, a physical weight that Alessandro Vale had spent years perfecting. He sat in the corner, a predator draped in a crisp white shirt, watching the world through the amber lens of his whiskey. To anyone else, he was a titan of the underworld, but inside, he was a man suffocating under the weight of his own intensity. 20 women had tried to match that weight in as many days. Each one had shattered, their eyes filling with a glass-like terror the moment he demanded they truly see him. He was tired of fragility. He was tired of being the only one in the room who didn't tremble. Then the air in the room shifted. It wasn't a dramatic change, but a subtle correction in the atmosphere. Alira Knoll walked toward him, her classic black waitress uniform fitting her with a discipline that felt like a dare. She didn't approach with the frantic, pleasing energy of the others. She moved with a preternatural calm, her sleeves rolled just enough to show she was there to work, her dark hair pulled into a bun that signaled absolute composure. When she reached his table, she didn't stop at the edge of his shadow. She stepped directly into it. Leaning in, she didn't just place his drink. She anchored herself, one arm brushing the back of his chair, her face inches from his. The scent of rain and cold iron clung to her, a sharp contrast to the suffocating perfumes of the women who had failed before her. "You're starring, Alessandro," she murmured, her voice a low, steady hum that lacked even a flicker of hesitation. He tracked the movement of her lips, his pulse thrumming with a sudden, violent demand for control. Most people couldn't hold his gaze for 3 seconds. She was going on 30. He reached out, his fingers hovering just an inch from the pulse point on her neck, testing the stamina of her resolve. "I'm waiting for you to break," he admitted, his voice dropping to a tone that made grown men sweat. Alira didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned closer, her eyes dropping to his mouth with a quiet certainty that felt like a trap. "Then you'll be waiting a long time. I don't break for men who play at being monsters because they're afraid to be human." She pulled back slowly, her hand lingering on his shoulder for a second too long, leaving a trail of heat through his shirt. But as she turned to leave, a small, silver object slipped from her fingers onto the table. Alessandro's own encrypted burner phone, the one he kept in his inner pocket, now lying between them. She had pickpocketed the most dangerous man in Seoul, while he was busy trying to dominate her. Alessandro stared at the device, then at her retreating back, a dark, genuine smile finally tugging at his lips. She wasn't just a match for his intensity, she was the one who had been hunting him all along. Is Alessandro truly the one in control, or has he just handed the keys to his empire to the only woman who knows his greatest secret? Stay tuned to see what happens when the unthinkable touch becomes an undeniable obsession in the next chapter. The heavy, velvet silence of the VIP lounge didn't just surround Alessandro, it bowed to him. Every head in the room was habitually lowered, a collective surrender to the man who commanded empires with a whisper. He sat in the center of the dead zone, his white shirt stark against the shadows, his presence a crushing weight that had sent 20 women running in a single month. He was a man who required a specific kind of stamina to endure, not just physical, but an emotional fortitude that seemed extinct in his world. Then the double doors clicked. Alira Knoll didn't walk. She reclaimed the floor. Her classic black waitress uniform was a study in restraint, the white apron cinched tight against a waist that moved with a terrifyingly deliberate grace. As she approached the most feared man in Seoul, she didn't offer the expected bow of a subordinate. Instead, she rolled her sleeves with a surgical precision that made Alessandro's pulse thrum with an unfamiliar rhythm, anticipation. The air turned electric as she entered his personal space. She didn't stop at the edge of the table. She leaned over his shoulder, her body a whisper away from his. Her breath, cool and steady, brushed against the sensitive skin of his neck, a bold violation of his untouchable status. Alessandro sat perfectly still, his muscles coiling under the pressure of her proximity. He was a master of performance and psychological command, yet here was a girl in a uniform setting, a pace he hadn't authorized. "You look like a man who's used to being feared, Alessandro," she murmured, her voice a low, melodic challenge that vibrated through his spine. "But fear is just a lack of imagination." She reached out, her fingers lingering just a second too long as she adjusted the glass of whiskey before him. It was a move of pure dominance, a test of his legendary restraint. Alessandro looked up, his dark eyes searching hers for the inevitable flicker of terror. He found only a serene, bottomless confidence that mirrored his own. He began to reach for her, his hand intending to reclaim the lead, but his fingers froze. Tucked subtly beneath the base of his glass was a small, encrypted keycard, one that belonged to his private vault, a piece of security he hadn't even realized was missing from his pocket. Elira straightened, a ghost of a smile touching her lips as she stepped back into the light. She hadn't just come to serve him. She had already breached his most intimate defenses while he was busy being distracted by her scent. She wasn't a victim of his intensity. She was the architect of his next crisis. Does Elira hold the key to Alessandro's heart? Or is she the one woman who finally has the power to dismantle his entire empire from the inside out? Discover the truth behind her unthinkable confidence in the next chapter. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and cold ambition, overlooking a city that Alessandro Vale owned in every way but one. He sat at the head of a mahogany table laid for two, the candlelight flickering against his jawline. He had summoned Elira not to work, but to witness, to see if the girl who had breached his security could survive his silence. He had spent a fortune on the vintage Bordeaux breathe between them, a calculated display of the wealth and weight that usually crushed the spirit of anyone who sat in that chair. He wanted to see her small. He wanted to see her realize that while she could steal a keycard, she could never possess the man who held the keys. The heavy doors groaned open. Elira didn't enter with the hesitant steps of a guest. She walked with the same terrifyingly deliberate grace she had shown in the lounge, her classic black waitress uniform replaced by a silk slip dressed the color of midnight. It was a tactical choice. The garment clung to her like a second skin, a silent testament to her confidence. As she took her seat, she didn't look at the expensive silver or the view. She looked directly at him. "You're trying too hard, Alessandro," she said, the words a low, velvety strike against his composure. "You think diamonds and old wine are enough to keep me at a distance." Alessandro leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. The performance pressure in the room was suffocating. He was used to setting the rhythm of the hunt, but Elira was sitting perfectly still, her posture an unspoken challenge to his stamina. He reached across the table, his fingers grazing the stem of her glass, his eyes promising a brand of dominance that went far beyond business. "I don't play games with children, Elira," he rasped, his voice a calculated vibration of authority. "Then stop acting like a boy afraid to be touched," she countered. She stood up, moving around the table until she was behind him. She leaned down, her lips inches from his ear, and ran a single, cool finger down the center of his palm, a touch so light it was almost a ghost, yet it rattled the foundation of his restraint more than any scream ever could. Alessandro's breath hitched, his body betraying the control he spent a lifetime building. He turned to seize her wrist, to finally reassert the power he felt slipping away, but stopped when she dropped a small, leather-bound notebook onto his lap. He recognized the crest immediately. It wasn't his. It belonged to the head of the rival syndicate, the man Alessandro had been trying to infiltrate for 3 years. "I didn't come here to be your mistress, Alessandro," she whispered, her voice devoid of the playfulness from before. "I came to tell you that your rival has been dead for 48 hours, and I'm the one who did it." The air in the room didn't just turn cold, it vanished. Alessandro looked at the notebook, then at the girl who had stood behind him like a shadow, realizing that the waitress wasn't his obsession, she was his superior. Has Alessandro found his greatest ally, or has he invited his executioner to dinner? Discover the true depth of Alira's deadly performance and who really holds the power in the next chapter. The revelation of the notebook lay between them like a live wire, yet Alira had already transitioned back into the uniform of discipline. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, her silhouette sharp and unyielding, her midnight silk dress draped over her frame with a poise that felt more like armor than an invitation. Alessandro watched her from the head of the table, his whiskey forgotten. He was a man obsessed with the mechanics of power, and he realized with a jolt of adrenaline that Alira's waitress persona, the rolled sleeves, the tight bun, the quiet service, wasn't a job. It was a masterclass in psychological stamina. She had used the most invisible role in the room to dismantle his world. "You're trying to find the crack in the porcelain, aren't you, Alessandro?" she asked without turning. Her voice held a rhythmic, predatory confidence that matched the thrum of his own heart. He rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate, the predator finally closing the distance. He stood directly behind her, not touching, but allowing the heat of his presence to act as an unspoken demand. He wanted to see if her composure held when the air grew thin, when the performance shifted from the public lounge to the suffocating intimacy of his private sanctuary. He leaned down, his lips ghosting against the shell of her ear. "I don't look for cracks," he rasped, his hand hovering inches from her waist, testing the restraint of his own desire. "I look for what it takes to make someone lose their rhythm. You haven't missed a beat yet." "Performance is easy when you have nothing to lose," she countered, finally turning to face him. The proximity was a physical assault. The space between them was charged with a desire so heavy it felt like a third person in the room. She reached up, her fingers grazing the top button of his white shirt, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that demanded he match her courage. He expected her to yield, to finally show a tremor of the fear that had sent 20 other women fleeing. Instead, she leaned into him, her weight a subtle anchor against his chest. But as his arms finally circled her to claim the dominance he craved, he felt something cold pressed against the small of his back. It wasn't a weapon. It was his own signet ring, the one he had worn for 20 years, the symbol of his absolute authority over the Vale Empire, resting in her open palm. She hadn't just taken his secrets or his rival's life. She had walked through his defenses and stripped him of his identity while he was busy admiring her restraint. "I didn't kill your rival for you, Alessandro," she whispered, her gaze dropping to his lips with a terrifyingly calm hunger. "I killed him because he was standing in the way of the only man I intend to break." Is Alessandro being seduced by a partner or dismantled by a successor who has already mastered the art of his own game? Discover who truly holds the crown when the performance moves from the boardroom to the bedroom in the next chapter. The signet ring lay heavy and cold in Alira's palm, a silent mockery of the fortress Alessandro had built around his life. He stared down at the gold crest, then up at the woman who stood in his shadow, realizing that his obsession with her waitress persona had been his greatest tactical error. The crisp white accents and the tight, disciplined bun weren't just a uniform. They were a blindfold she had used to lead him exactly where she wanted him. Her composure wasn't a product of service. It was the lethal stillness of a seasoned operative who had mastered the art of psychological stamina. "You move like a ghost, Alira," Alessandro murmured, his voice thick with a mixture of fury and a dark, undeniable arousal. He stepped closer, pinning her between his desk and the weight of his presence. He wanted to see her pulse jump. He wanted to find the limit of the girl who had walked through his elite security as if they were nothing more than furniture. Most people would be terrified to hold that ring. They'd know it's a death sentence. "Fear is a performance, Alessandro. When I stopped practicing a long time ago," she replied, her eyes never wavering from his. She didn't shrink under his gaze. She leaned into it, her body language calm and assertive. She reached out, her fingers slow and deliberate as she slid the ring back onto his finger. The touch was electric, a calculated breach of his personal space that felt like a claim rather than a return. He grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but not bruising, his thumb tracing the delicate skin where her heartbeat should have been racing. It was steady, terrifyingly steady. The performance pressure in the room shifted. He was no longer the hunter evaluating prey. He was a man realizing he was the one being tested for endurance. "You think you can break me?" he rasped, his face inches from hers, his breath hitching as her other hand came up to rest against his chest, right over his thundering heart. "I don't think, Alessandro. I know," she whispered, her lips ghosting over his. But as he leaned in to finally shatter the distance between them, Alira's hand moved from his chest to the holster hidden beneath his own jacket. With a flick of her wrist, she didn't pull his weapon. She replaced the magazine with a different one marked with the seal of Interpol. She stepped back, the serene mask finally cracking into a sharp, triumphant smile. "I didn't come here to kill your rival, Alessandro. I came here to see if you were worth the effort of saving before my team raids this building in 20 minutes. The man who owned the city felt the world tilt. The Waitress wasn't a rival, and she wasn't an assassin. She was the law, and he had just spent the last hour proving he was exactly the kind of monster she was trained to hunt. Has Alessandro's desire led him straight into a high-stakes trap, or is Alira's final play the ultimate test of who truly dominates the shadow world? The clock is ticking on their most dangerous performance, yet in the next chapter. The grand ballroom was a sea of predatory silk and whispered treachery, but Alessandro Vale saw only the woman on his arm. To the world, Alira was the stunning fiancée of a king, her presence a silent declaration of his total possession. In reality, every step they took was a battle of psychological stamina. She had traded the crisp waitress uniform for a gown of liquid gold that clung to her with a confidence that mocked the room's hidden daggers. Her posture was a masterclass in restrained power. She didn't just walk beside him, she anchored him, her hand resting on his forearm with a grip that was light, deliberate, and entirely in control. "Smile, Alessandro," she murmured, her voice a velvet caress that didn't reach her eyes. "They're watching to see if you can handle the weight of what you've claimed." The performance pressure was agonizing. Alessandro was a man who demanded absolute dominance, but Alira was playing a deeper game. As they moved through the crowd, she leaned into him, her breath ghosting against his ear as she whispered the secrets of every man they passed, weaknesses, debts, and hidden sins. She was performing the role of the devoted lover with a lethal precision that made the public desire in the room palpable, yet between them, the tension was a taut wire ready to snap. He led her to a shadowed alcove, his hand sliding down to the small of her back, the heat of his palm seeping through the thin silk. He wanted to reclaim the lead, to prove that his stamina wasn't just a matter of reputation. He trapped her against the marble pillar, his body a silent demand for surrender. "You're playing a dangerous game, Alira," he rasped, his eyes searching hers for a tremor, a slip, anything that proved he still held the reins. "This fiancé act, you're enjoying it too much." "I don't play games I haven't already won," she countered, her hand traveling up his chest to adjust his tie, her fingers lingering just a second too long against the frantic beat of his heart. She looked up at him, her expression serene, as if she were the one granting him the privilege of her proximity. But as Alessandro leaned in, the air between them thick with the scent of jasmine and impending collapse, he felt a sharp, rhythmic vibration against his side. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his private comms device. A message was flashing on the screen, but it wasn't from his security team. It was a live feed from his own secure vault, showing the heavy steel doors swinging open from the inside. He looked back at Alira, her smile finally turning sharp and predatory. "The gala wasn't the performance, Alessandro," she whispered, her voice a chillingly beautiful lullaby. "The gala was the distraction. While you were busy showing me off to your rivals, my people were busy emptying your world." The man who owned everything realized he was standing in a room full of enemies, holding the hand of the only woman who had ever truly outplayed him. Has Alessandro lost his empire for a single night of staged desire? Or is this the moment he decides that Alira is worth more than everything he's ever owned? Discover who truly holds the winning hand in the next chapter. The heavy mahogany door of the library clicked shut, sealing them in a room that smelled of old leather and the sharp, electric scent of an impending storm. Alessandro didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need them. The moonlight bleeding through the high windows was enough to catch the liquid gold of Alira's dress and the dangerous, predatory glint in his own eyes. For years, Alessandro had been the architect of his own isolation, a man whose sheer physical and psychological presence acted as a barrier no one dared to cross. But Alira hadn't just crossed it. She had moved in and started rearranging the furniture of his soul. "You should be running," Alessandro rasped, his voice a jagged edge in the dark. He moved toward her, his pace slow, each step a calculated assertion of the dominance he was desperately trying to reclaim. "I have lost my vault, my rivals are circling, and I am currently looking for someone to blame." He pinned her against the door, his hands slamming into the wood on either side of her head. The forced proximity was a physical weight, a test of her stamina and his own rapidly fraying restraint. He leaned in until their foreheads touched, his breath hitching as he inhaled the scent of jasmine and cold iron that seemed to define her. Most women would have withered. Alira simply tilted her head back, her throat a pale, tempting line in the shadows. "Then blame me," she whispered, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the middle of his chaos. She didn't shrink. She stepped forward, closing the microscopic gap between them until her chest pressed against his white shirt, her heart beating a rhythm that was, infuriatingly, perfectly synchronized with his. "But don't pretend you're angry about the money, Alessandro. You're angry because, for the first time in your life, you aren't the most dangerous thing in the room." She reached up, her fingers sliding into his hair, her grip firm and possessive. It wasn't a caress, it was a claim. Alessandro felt his control slip, the performance of the untouchable boss crumbling under the sheer confidence of her touch. He wanted to break her composure, to hear her gasp, to see her finally lose the rhythm she had maintained since the moment they met. He bent his head to hers, his lips inches from the surrender he craved, but he stopped when he felt her press a small, cold object into the center of his chest. He looked down, expecting a blade or a wire. It was a glass vial. Inside, a deep crimson liquid glowed faintly in the moonlight. "My people didn't empty your vault for profit, Alessandro," she murmured, her eyes locking onto his with a terrifying, protective intensity. "They emptied it because your inner circle had already poisoned your supply. If you had taken your usual tonight, you'd be dead. I didn't steal your empire. I just kidnapped it until I could find the traitor." The storm outside finally broke, rain lashing against the glass, but the real shift was inside. Alessandro realized that Alira wasn't his enemy, and she wasn't just a partner. She was the only person who knew he was being hunted from within. Has Alessandro's greatest threat been sitting at his right hand all along? And can he trust the woman who just dismantled his life to help him take it back? The shadows are closing in, and the true test of their alliance begins in the next chapter. The storm outside the library was nothing compared to the silence that followed Alira's revelation. Alessandro stood frozen, the vial of crimson liquid a cold weight against his chest. For a man who had built his life on the absolute predictability of power, the realization that his own blood, his inner circle, had turned against him was a jagged glass edge to his ego. But it was the woman standing in his space, her eyes reflecting the moonlight with a terrifying, serene clarity, who truly unsettled him. He moved away from the door, his steps heavy, the predator's grace replaced by a raw, unvarnished tension. He stopped by the fireplace, his hands gripping the cold stone mantel until his knuckles turned white. "You think you've saved me," he rasped, his voice echoing with a hollow, dark fatigue. "But you've only preserved a monster. Do you know why those 20 women fled, Alira? It wasn't because of the danger outside these walls. It was because they looked at me and realized there was nothing human left to touch." He turned to her, expecting to see the first flicker of the glass he had become so accustomed to. He wanted her to be repulsed. He needed her to be, because if she wasn't, then everything he believed about his own isolation was a lie. Alira didn't move away. Instead, she walked into the center of the room, her footsteps silent on the rug. She approached him with the same waitress discipline she'd used to dismantle his world, deliberate, measured, and entirely unimpressed by his display of darkness. She stopped inches from him, her gaze traveling up his frame until it locked onto his. "You use your power as a shield to keep from being known, Alessandro," she whispered. She reached out, her fingers slow and steady as she unbuttoned the top of his shirt, her knuckles grazing the skin she had been told was untouchable. "You aren't a monster. You're just a man who has forgotten how to be handled." She placed her hand over his heart, her warmth seeping through his skin, a direct challenge to the beast he claimed to be. Alessandro's breath hitched. The performance of the cold king was failing. The stamina required to maintain his mask was evaporating under the simple, fearless pressure of her palm. He felt a terrifying urge to yield, to let the weight of his empire fall away and simply exist in her calm. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes closing as he prepared to finally surrender to the pull of her presence. But then, he felt her hand move from his chest to the small of his back, and his eyes snapped open. He felt a familiar, rhythmic ticking. He pulled back, looking at her hand. She wasn't holding a weapon or a ring. She was holding a small, silver mechanical device he had seen once before, years ago, the signature, dead man's switch of the very man she claimed to have killed. "I didn't just kidnap your empire to find the traitor, Alessandro," she said, her voice now a chilling, professional deadpan. "I did it because the traitor is me, and if your heart rate drops below a certain level, we both go up with the building." The woman who had tamed him wasn't his savior or his subordinate. She was his captor, and the intimacy he felt was the only thing keeping them both alive. Has Alessandro's search for a match led him into a permanent trap? Or is the ticking clock the only thing that can finally force him to master his own heart? The ultimate game of survival and seduction reaches its breaking point in the next chapter. The industrial basement was a tomb of concrete and cold iron, a stark contrast to the velvet luxury Alessandro had occupied hours ago. He was bound to a chair, his white shirt torn, but his eyes remained fixed on the woman standing 10 feet away. Elira was strapped to a metal frame, the dead man's switch still glinting against her palm, while the remnants of his rival's splintered faction stood over her. They had intercepted their escape, thinking they had found the king's greatest weakness, the waitress who had dared to claim his shadow. The lead interrogator, a man whose hands trembled with the desire to break what Alessandro loved, brought a heavy blade to the hollow of Elira's throat. "Tell me the codes, Vale, or I start with her eyes." Alessandro didn't look at the knife. He looked at Elira. The performance pressure in the room was absolute, a suffocating vacuum where one slip in composure would end in a bloodbath. He watched her carefully. Her breathing was a slow, rhythmic lullaby. Even with steel biting into her skin, she didn't flinch. She didn't plead. She looked at the man holding the blade with a chilling, clinical boredom that made the kidnappers look like amateur children. "You're wasting your time," Elira said, her voice like silk over stone. She turned her gaze to Alessandro, her eyes locking onto his with a searing, intimate confidence. "He won't speak because he knows I don't break. Do you, Alessandro?" A strange, dark pride swelled in his chest. Most women were glass, but Elira was diamond. He watched as they applied pressure, a thin red line blooming on her shoulder, yet her pulse, visible in the vein of her neck, remained steady. Her stamina wasn't just physical, it was a psychological fortress. She was proving, through every silent second of agony, that she was the only person in his world with the verticality to stand beside him. "She's right," Alessandro rasped, a predatory smile finally breaking through his fatigue. "You can't use her against me, because she isn't mine to protect. She's the one who's been protecting you from me." The interrogator laughed, raising the blade for a final strike, but Elira's smile turned razor-sharp. With a sudden, violent grace, she didn't struggle against her bonds. She leaned into them, using the tension to snap the dead man's switch in her hand. The room didn't explode. Instead, every light in the building turned a deep, warning crimson, and the heavy iron doors sealed shut with a hydraulic hiss. Elira stepped out of her restraints, which had been unlocked for minutes, and handed the dead man's switch to Alessandro. It wasn't a trigger. It was a remote override. "The takeover was never theirs, Alessandro," she whispered, stepping over the now terrified men as his elite security flooded the room from the vents. "I let them take us because your inner circle wasn't just in your vault. They were in this room, and I needed you to see them die." She had used herself as live bait to flush out his traitors, turning a kidnapping into a curated execution. Alessandro realized then that her torture had been a calculated performance, a test of his own ability to sit still while she bled for his crown. Is Alessandro ready to kneel to the woman who just saved his life with a blood-soaked lie? Or has Elira's ruthless performance finally crossed a line he can't forgive? The true cost of their union is revealed in the next chapter. The blood-stained concrete of the basement was miles away, replaced by the hushed, incense-heavy air of Alessandro's private sanctuary. Here, the glass walls didn't look out over the city. They looked inward, toward a pool of dark water that mirrored the storm-tossed sky. Alessandro stood by the window, his torn shirt discarded, the heavy muscles of his back tense with the effort of holding his world together. For the first time, the dead zone he carried felt like a weight he no longer wanted to bear alone. Elira moved through the shadows of the room, her presence no longer that of a waitress or an operative, but of a force that had seen the very bottom of his soul and decided it was worth the descent. She approached him from behind, her footsteps silent. She didn't touch him immediately. She waited, allowing the tension to build until the air between them was thick enough to choke on. "You're still waiting for the glass to shatter, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice a warm caress against his spine. Alessandro turned, his gaze raw. The king had been dismantled. His vault was empty, his inner circle was dead, and his body was a map of the day's violence. 20 women, he rasped, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, silent plea. "They all saw a monster. What do you see, Elira?" She stepped into his space, her hands rising to rest on his shoulders. Her touch wasn't tentative. It was a firm, grounding pressure that demanded he stay present. "I see a man who has used dominance to hide his fear of being handled. I see a man who is exhausted by his own performance." She leaned in, her lips grazing his jawline, her breath a steady rhythm that forced his own lungs to find their pace. Alessandro let out a shuddering breath, his forehead dropping onto her shoulder. The surrender was total. He wasn't the boss, the predator, or the king. He was simply a man finding his match in a woman whose stamina for his darkness exceeded his own. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into him with a hunger that wasn't about conquest, but about the terrifying relief of being seen. But as he pulled back to finally meet her mouth, his hand brushed the delicate skin of her inner wrist. He felt something he hadn't noticed in the heat of the basement or the chaos of the gala. He felt the cold, hard edges of a surgical implant beneath her skin, right where her pulse should be. He looked at her, his eyes widening as a new realization took hold. "Your pulse," he whispered. "It never jumped, not because you're fearless, but because it's regulated." Elira's expression didn't change, but her eyes darkened with a tragic, haunting depth. "I told you I was trained for this, Alessandro. My heart literally cannot beat for you. I was designed to be the only woman you couldn't break, because I'm the only one who can't feel you at all." Alessandro's world tilted. The connection he thought he had finally found, the equal he had craved, was a biological masterpiece of isolation, leaving him more alone in her arms than he had ever been in his empty bed. Has Alessandro finally found his soulmate only to discover she is physically incapable of loving him back? Or is there a way to break the machine and find the woman underneath? The final, devastating truth of their bond awaits in the concluding chapter. The morning sun bled over the Seoul skyline, turning the glass walls of the Vale headquarters into a shimmering blade. Inside the boardroom, the air was static. The city's power players sat in a row, their faces pale, waiting for the monster to emerge from the wreckage of the week's betrayals. When the doors finally swept open, Alessandro didn't enter alone. He walked with a measured, predatory grace, his presence doubled by the woman at his side. Elira had returned to the classic black uniform, crisp, disciplined, and utterly composed. But as she stood behind his chair, her hand resting on the leather just inches from his neck, the dynamic had shifted. She wasn't his servant, she was his architect. The way Alessandro sat, relaxed, his stamina restored, his eyes no longer hollow, told the room everything they needed to know. He had found his anchor, and in doing so, he had become twice as dangerous. The old empire was built on fear, Alessandro said, his voice a low vibration that commanded every molecule of oxygen in the room. The new one is built on something much harder to kill. He leaned back, his shoulder brushing Alira's hip. The psychological command they projected was a masterclass in shared dominance. He looked up at her, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the boss slipped, revealing the man who had finally found a match for his intensity. He reached back, his fingers tracing the surgical scar on her wrist, the place where the regulator sat, supposedly ensuring she would never feel the heat of his touch. The board members began to speak, offering their groveling loyalty, but Alessandro was focused only on the steady, rhythmic pressure of Alira's hand. He felt the silence between them deepen, a conversation of skin and spirit that bypassed the words being spoken in the room. He was a man who had everything, but he realized now that his greatest performance was just beginning, the act of loving a woman who had been biologically forbidden from loving him back. But then, as he pressed his thumb against her pulse point in a silent gesture of solidarity, Alessandro froze. Underneath the cold, mechanical ticking of the regulator, there was a secondary beat. It was erratic, soft, and growing louder. It wasn't the rhythmic thrum of a machine. It was the frantic, desperate gallop of a human heart breaking through its cage. He looked up at her, his breath catching. Alira's serene expression hadn't changed, but a single, hot tear escaped her eye, tracking a path down her cheek. The unbreakable machine was failing, destroyed not by a weapon, but by the sheer, unbridled stamina of the man she had tried to captivate. She hadn't been sent to save him or arrest him. She had been sent to see if he was capable of breaking the impossible, and his touch had just short-circuited her very existence. If the machine dies, does the woman die with it? Or is Alessandro about to discover that the only thing more dangerous than a heartless assassin is a woman who has just found her soul? The final, lethal heartbeat of their story begins in the next part of the story.